The summer of 1943 had turned the Russian steppe into a furnace. Inside the Panzer IV tank, the temperature exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Friedrich Müller wiped the sweat from his forehead with a blackened hand, leaving another dark streak across his face. The smell of cordite, diesel fuel, and human sweat had become so familiar that he no longer noticed it. Outside, the thunder of artillery created a constant backdrop to their existence. The tank crew had been operating together for 8 months now. Hans, the driver, sat in his cramped position at the front, his hands gripping the controls with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to feel the terrain through steel and machinery. Klaus, the gunner, kept his eye pressed to the sight, scanning the horizon for any sign of Soviet armor. Young Peter, barely 19 years old, served as the loader, his arms still strong despite the months of exhaustion. And Friedrich commanded them all from his position in the turret, his head partially exposed through the hatch, binoculars constantly moving across the landscape. They had been part of the great offensive at Kursk, the massive operation that was supposed to break the Soviet lines and turn the tide of the war in the east. But things had not gone according to plan. The Soviets had known they were coming. They had prepared. And now, 3 weeks into the offensive, the German advance had ground to a halt amid minefields, anti-tank ditches, and an endless sea of Soviet armor. Friedrich's tank, designated number 412, had survived longer than most. They had knocked out 7 Soviet tanks in the first week alone. But survival came at a cost. Friedrich had watched 3 other tanks from his platoon brew up in flames, the crews screaming as they burned alive inside their steel coffins. He had learned not to think about it. Thinking about it meant hesitation, and hesitation meant death. The radio crackled to life, but the message was broken and distorted. Friedrich could only make out fragments. Pull back. Coordinates. 20 minutes. The communication equipment had been damaged 2 days ago when a Soviet shell had struck close enough to rattle every bolt in the tank's hull. They had been operating partially blind ever since, following the general direction of retreat that everyone seemed to be taking. Hans brought the tank to a halt on a small ridge, the engine idling with a deep rumble. Friedrich scanned the area ahead through his binoculars. The landscape was a nightmare of destroyed vehicles, both German and Soviet, their blackened hulks smoking in the afternoon heat. Craters from artillery shells pockmarked the earth like a diseased face. In the distance, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of Soviet T-34 tanks moving across the steppe, their sloped armor gleaming dully in the sun. Klaus reported in his calm, methodical voice, the voice he always used when things were dangerous. "Commander, I count 6 T-34s bearing 270, range approximately 2,000 meters. They haven't seen us yet." Friedrich made a quick calculation. 6 against 1 were not good odds, even with the Panzer IV's superior gun. The T-34s were faster, more maneuverable, and their sloped armor could deflect shots that would penetrate other tanks. But the German 75mm gun had better accuracy at range, and Klaus was the best gunner Friedrich had ever worked with. "How many rounds do we have left?" Friedrich asked, already knowing the answer would not be good. Peter's young voice came back, tinged with worry. 7 armor-piercing, Commander. 4 high-explosive. That's all. 11 rounds total. Friedrich felt his stomach tighten. They had started the offensive with over 80 rounds. Now they were down to 11, and the nearest supply depot was probably overrun or in full retreat. He was about to give the order to proceed cautiously when he saw something that made his blood run cold. About 400 meters ahead, in a shallow depression between 2 small hills, he spotted movement. German infantry, a group of them, maybe 12 or 15 men. They were moving slowly, too slowly. Even through the binoculars, Friedrich could see that several were being carried or supported by their comrades, wounded men, and they were moving directly into the path of the advancing Soviet tanks. "Hans, do you see them? The infantry ahead?" "Ja, Commander. Looks like they're in bad shape." Friedrich's mind raced. The standing orders were clear. Tank units were to withdraw immediately when outgunned or low on ammunition. Stopping to assist infantry was not part of the tactical doctrine. Tanks were valuable. Tank crews were trained and experienced, hard to replace. Infantry were everywhere. The cold calculus of war. But Friedrich found himself unable to give the order to move on. Those were German soldiers down there. Maybe some of them were from his own division. They were stumbling through the steppe, exhausted and bleeding, probably thinking they were moving towards safety. They had no idea that 6 Soviet tanks were closing in on their position. Klaus spoke up again. "Commander, those T-34s will reach the infantry in about 10 minutes. The infantry haven't seen them yet. I don't think they have any anti-tank weapons." 10 minutes. Friedrich looked at his crew. Hans was watching him in the small mirror, waiting for orders. Klaus remained focused on the gun sight, professional as always. Young Peter was looking up at him with wide eyes, the eyes of someone who still believed that right and wrong mattered in war. Friedrich knew what he should do. He should take his tank, bypass the infantry, and continue the retreat, preserve his machine and his crew for another day. That was the smart play. That was what a good tank commander would do. But Friedrich also knew what would happen to those infantry if he drove away. The Soviet tanks would roll right over them, machine gunning the survivors or crushing them under their treads. "Hans," Friedrich said quietly, "take us forward, slowly. Keep us hull down as much as possible." Hans didn't question the order. The tank lurched forward, descending from the ridge and moving toward the depression where the infantry struggled forward. The other crew members remained silent, each man alone with his thoughts. They all knew what this meant. They were choosing to engage 6 enemy tanks with 11 rounds of ammunition. The mathematics of survival had just become very complicated. As they approached the infantry, Friedrich could see their condition more clearly. These were remnants of a rifle company, torn apart by artillery or an armored assault. Their uniforms were caked with mud and blood. Several men had crude bandages wrapped around various wounds. One soldier was being carried between 2 others, his legs trailing uselessly. They looked up as the Panzer IV approached, and Friedrich could see the hope that flooded into their exhausted faces. Friedrich climbed partially out of the turret hatch and waved to get their attention. An Unteroffizier, a sergeant, stumbled toward the tank, his left arm in a makeshift sling. "Thank God," the sergeant gasped. "We've been walking for 6 hours. The whole line collapsed. Our officers are dead. We thought we were alone." "How many of you?" Friedrich asked. 14. 5 seriously wounded. We need to get them to a field hospital." Friedrich glanced toward the horizon where the Soviet tanks were still advancing, now maybe 1,500 meters away. They would have seen his tank by now. They would be deploying into attack formation. "Listen to me carefully," Friedrich told the sergeant. "Take your wounded and move directly south as fast as you can. Don't stop, don't look back. There are Soviet tanks coming, and I'm going to try to slow them down. You have maybe 15 minutes. Do you understand?" The sergeant's eyes widened as he grasped the situation. "But you can't fight all of them alone. We won't be fighting them long. Now go. That's an order." The sergeant nodded, his face grim, and turned to rally his men. They began moving south with renewed urgency, the able-bodied soldiers practically carrying the wounded. Friedrich watched them for a moment, then dropped back into the turret and sealed the hatch above him. "Klaus, targets at 1,000 meters and closing. We need to make every shot count. We're not trying to kill all of them, just slow them down enough for the infantry to escape." "Understood, Commander." Friedrich positioned the tank in a hull-down position, on the forward slope of a small rise, maximizing their armor protection while giving Klaus a clear field of fire. The T-34s were now clearly visible, moving in a loose formation that would bring them directly through this area. They had definitely seen the Panzer IV. The Soviet commanders were probably assessing the situation, trying to decide if this was a lone tank or the forward element of a larger force. "Range 900 meters, Klaus reported. "Lead tank is moving to flank us on the left. Target the lead tank. Fire when ready." Klaus made minute adjustments to the gun elevation and traverse. The turret whirred slightly. Everyone in the tank held their breath. Then Klaus squeezed the trigger. The Panzer IV rocked back as the 75mm gun fired, with a deafening blast. Inside the confined space, even with headsets, the sound was overwhelming. The smell of cordite immediately filled the turret. Friedrich's eyes were on the target. He saw the tracer from the round arc across the space, saw it strike the lead T-34 squarely on the turret front. But the Soviet tank kept moving. The round had glanced off the sloped armor. "Miss," Klaus said calmly. "Correction and reloading." Peter worked frantically, ejecting the spent shell casing and ramming home a new round. The brass casing clattered on the floor, adding to the collection of spent rounds at their feet. "Loaded. Firing." The second round caught the T-34 on the side as it turned, punching through the thinner armor. The Soviet tank shuddered to a halt, smoke beginning to pour from its engine deck. A moment later, the crew hatches flew open and men scrambled out. "Hit!" Friedrich called out. "One down. Target the next tank." But the other 5 T-34s were not staying idle. They had spread out and were advancing from multiple angles, a classic tactic to divide the defenders' fire. Friedrich saw muzzle flashes from 2 of them. Seconds later, shells screamed overhead, one passing so close that Friedrich felt the air pressure change. Another round struck the ground 20 meters to their left, throwing up a huge geyser of dirt. "Hans, back us up 10 meters and shift left," Friedrich ordered. The tank reversed quickly, repositioning to throw off the Soviet gunner's aim. Klaus already had another target selected. Firing! Another hit, this time on a T-34's frontal armor at about 700 meters. The Soviet tank stopped, its engine probably disabled, but its gun was still functional. Friedrich saw its turret beginning to traverse toward them. "Move, Hans! Move now!" The Panzer IV lurched backward, just as the disabled T-34 fired. The shell passed through the space where they had been moments before. But now the other Soviet tanks were getting closer, their superior speed allowing them to close the distance rapidly. Friedrich knew they couldn't stay static. In a mobile engagement at close range, the T-34's maneuverability would give them the advantage. "Klaus, one more shot then we move. Target the tank on the right flank." The gun fired again. This time the round struck a T-34 in the track, immobilizing it but not destroying it. 3 tanks neutralized, but 3 more still perfectly capable of killing them, and they now had only 7 rounds left. The radio suddenly crackled with a burst of clearer sound. "All units, immediate withdrawal. Bridge destroyed in 30 minutes. Friedrich felt ice in his stomach. If the bridges were being destroyed, it meant a full retreat was underway. They needed to get out of this area now, or they would be cut off behind Soviet lines. He glanced at his watch. The infantry had been moving for about 8 minutes. They probably weren't clear yet. 2 more Soviet shells screamed in, one striking the ground directly in front of the tank, showering them with dirt and rocks. The other hit their glacis plate, the frontal armor, with a tremendous clang. The tank shook violently, and for a moment, Friedrich's vision went white. When it cleared, he could taste blood in his mouth. He had bitten his tongue. "Damage report!" "Armor held," Hans called back. "But that was too close." The 3 remaining T-34s were now within 500 meters and closing fast. At this range, they could penetrate the Panzer IV's armor much more easily. Friedrich made a split-second decision. "Hans, hard left and forward. We're going to charge them." It was a desperate, almost suicidal move, but Friedrich knew that if they stayed static, the T-34s would simply circle around them and hit them from the vulnerable sides and rear. By charging forward, he could at least keep them facing the enemy's front armor, where they had the best protection. And maybe, just maybe, he could get close enough that the Soviet gunners would panic. The Panzer IV surged forward, its engine roaring. Klaus fired on the move, the gun's stabilization system doing its best to keep the aim steady. The round went wide, missing completely. The tank was now bouncing and swaying as Hans pushed it to maximum speed across the rough terrain. A Soviet shell screamed past, so close that Friedrich could have reached out and touched it. Another struck the turret side with a glancing blow that sent a shower of sparks across his vision. The armor held, but Friedrich knew they were incredibly lucky. 1 solid hit and they would be finished. 500 meters, 400, 300, Klaus fired again. The round struck a T-34 at nearly point-blank range, punching clean through the front armor and causing a catastrophic explosion. The Soviet tank literally came apart, its turret flying 20 meters into the air before crashing back to Earth. But the other 2 T-34s were now on either side of them, trying to get shots at their vulnerable flanks. Peter, high explosive round, load high explosive. Friedrich had an idea. At this close range, even a high explosive shell might damage a tank's tracks or external equipment. And they were out of armor-piercing rounds for the moment anyway. The tanks slewed to the right as Hans tried to keep their front armor facing the biggest threat. Klaus rotated the turret frantically, trying to track a target. The whole world had become noise and violence and the smell of burning metal. Loaded! Firing! The high explosive round struck the ground directly beneath a T-34, the blast lifting the Soviet tank slightly and throwing it onto its side. It wasn't destroyed, but it was out of the fight. One Soviet tank left, and Friedrich could see it backing away, probably trying to get some distance to take a better shot. Hans, pursue! Don't let him get range! But as they moved forward, Friedrich heard a sound that made his heart stop. A grinding, screeching sound from inside the tank, and the vehicle lurched to a halt. Engines overheating, Hans shouted. We're losing power. Friedrich looked at the temperature gauge and saw it was in the red zone. The sprint at maximum speed across rough terrain had pushed the engine beyond its limits. Smoke was beginning to seep into the crew compartment. They were dead in the water. The last T-34 had stopped about 400 meters away, its turret slowly traversing toward them. Friedrich knew they had maybe 10 seconds before that gun fired and ended everything. Klaus, can you hit him? Ja, Commander. Ready. Then do it. Now. The Panzer IV's gun fired one last time. Friedrich held his breath, watching the tracer arc across the space between them. The round struck the T-34 squarely on the turret, and this time there was no deflection. The Soviet tank erupted in flames, thick black smoke billowing into the sky. For a moment, there was silence. The battlefield had gone quiet except for the crackling of flames and the distant rumble of artillery. Friedrich slowly became aware that they were still alive. Against all odds, they had survived. Status report, Friedrich said quietly. Engines seized, Hans reported. We're not moving this tank without major repairs. Guns fine, Klaus added. But we're down to 4 rounds, all high explosive. Friedrich climbed out of the turret and looked around. 5 destroyed or disabled Soviet tanks scattered across the steppe, and in the distance, moving south, he could see the infantry. They were almost out of sight now, probably safe from any immediate pursuit. They would make it. But Friedrich's tank was finished, immobile, low on ammunition, and behind what would soon be Soviet lines. He made a decision. Everyone out. Grab your personal weapons and anything useful. We're going to disable the tank and move out on foot. The crew climbed out, their movements slow and exhausted. Peter looked like he was going to be sick. Hans was limping, having apparently injured his leg during the violent maneuvering. Klaus simply sat on the turret, staring at nothing. Friedrich pulled the demolition charge from its storage compartment and set it with a 5-minute delay. They would deny the Soviets the use of their tank, even if they couldn't save it themselves. Come on, Friedrich said, helping Hans to his feet. We need to catch up with that infantry unit. We're all infantry now. The 4 men moved away from their tank, the machine that had been their home, their weapon, and their protection for 8 months. Friedrich heard the demolition charge detonate behind them, felt the blast wave push at his back. He didn't look back. There was no point. They walked south through the afternoon heat, following the trail left by the wounded infantry. Friedrich's mind was already calculating. They were maybe 20 kilometers behind what used to be German lines. They had 4 rifles, 2 pistols, and whatever ammunition they carried on their persons. The summer night would be short, and they needed to cover as much ground as possible under darkness. But they had saved 14 men. 14 soldiers who would otherwise have died in the lonely steppe, crushed under Soviet tanks or cut down by machine gun fire. Friedrich told himself it had been worth it. He tried to believe it. As the sun began to set, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of red and orange, Friedrich and his crew walked through the ruins of the Great Offensive. The campaign that was supposed to win the war had become a desperate struggle for survival. But they were still alive. And somehow, despite everything, that seemed like enough. Young Peter suddenly spoke up, his voice hoarse. Commander, do you think those infantry made it? Do you think they'll remember us? Friedrich looked at the young man, at his blackened face and haunted eyes. He thought about all the Other tanks and crews they had seen destroyed, all the men who had died, nameless and forgotten in this vast, terrible place. He thought about the choice he had made, the choice that had probably doomed his tank but might have saved 14 lives. "I don't know, Peter," Friedrich said honestly, "but we'll remember that we tried." They continued walking as darkness fell, 4 men in a landscape of destruction, heading toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the burning wreckage of the Panzer IV sent up a column of smoke that could be seen for miles, a marker of where they had made their stand, a memorial to the steel coffin that had kept them alive, right up until the moment it couldn't anymore. The war would continue without them. The great battles would be fought and won or lost by others. But in that small corner of the Russian steppe, Friedrich Müller and his crew had made their choice. They had chosen to fight when running was easier. They had chosen to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And in a war where individual choices seemed meaningless against the vast machinery of death, that small decision mattered to them. It mattered to them a great deal.